Two brothers from a Seventh-day Adventist family in Michigan accidentally discovered one of the most commercially valuable foods in American history. 6 of their 16 siblings had already died of infectious disease. Their father had not seen much point in educating them. He believed the second coming of Jesus was imminent. One brother contracted tuberculosis before he was a teenager. By 1906, the sanitarium that the older brother ran had grown from 106 patients in its opening year to 7,006 in a single year. Presidents came. Henry Ford came. The building that housed them cost $1 million to reconstruct after a fire leveled it in 1902. The younger brother spent 25 years helping build all of that and received no public credit. When he finally walked away and started his own company, the older brother sued him, not over profits, not over patents, over the right to use the family name. This is not a story about breakfast cereal. This is the story of two men who built an empire together and then spent the rest of their lives trying to destroy each other. If you want to follow this story as it unfolds, subscribe. There is considerably more to come. Chapter 1. The World That Made Them. The Kellogg family did not arrive in Battle Creek by accident. In 1834, John Preston Kellogg, a broom maker from Hadley, Massachusetts, where his ancestors had lived for 2 centuries, packed his family onto wagons and moved west into Michigan. The state was barely settled. Dense pine forests covered most of the land. Railroads were only beginning to connect the distant towns. John Preston eventually moved the family to Battle Creek to join a congregation of Seventh-day Adventists. He was among the small group of adherents who pledged money to persuade the church's founders, Ellen and James White, to relocate their publishing operations to Battle Creek in 1855. That decision would determine the entire direction of the family that followed. The Kellogg household was large, devout, and shaped by a theology that treated the physical body as a site of moral obligation. Ellen White preached, as historian Howard Markel describes it, a faith remarkable for its emphasis on a sound body and a strict slate of hygienic habits. No alcohol, no tobacco, no meat, no sexual excess. The body was to be kept pure in anticipation of the coming kingdom. John Preston Kellogg had 11 children with his second wife, Anne. Among them were 2 boys who would become the central figures of this story. John Harvey Kellogg was born in 1852. Will Keith Kellogg, called W.K., was born on April 7, 1860. 8 years separated them. The world they grew up in was medically brutal. 6 of their 16 siblings and half-siblings died of infectious diseases within a 9-year span. John Harvey himself contracted tuberculosis as a very young child, a condition that left his left lung permanently compromised. He also suffered several painful bowel disorders, worsened by the standard Michigan diet of overcooked grain, fried potatoes, and fatty meat. Their father was reluctant to educate either of them, partly because so many of his children died young, partly because the family believed, with genuine conviction, that the second coming of Jesus was imminent. Why spend money on schooling when the world was about to end? What saved John Harvey, intellectually, professionally, and perhaps literally, was Ellen White herself. She noticed the precocious young boy and hired him at 12 years old to work in the church's print shop, setting type and refilling inkwells. She would go on to arrange for his medical education, seeing in him a vehicle for the church's vision of a scientifically grounded health ministry. W.K. received no such patronage. He went to work early selling brooms and in late 1878 was sent to Dallas, Texas to help run a broom factory. He returned to Battle Creek in 1879, not to pursue an independent life, but to help his older brother manage an institution that was already becoming something extraordinary. From the beginning, the asymmetry was structural. One brother had been chosen. The other had come home to help. Chapter 2. The Sanitarium. In 1875, John Harvey Kellogg earned his medical degree from Bellevue Hospital Medical College in New York City. He was 23 years old. The following year, he was appointed superintendent of the Western Health Reform Institute in Battle Creek, a church-run facility that had opened 10 years earlier on a farm that sold for $11,000 with a staff of 2 doctors, a few bath attendants, and initially just 1 patient. Kellogg immediately renamed it. He took the word sanatorium, defined at the time as a health resort for invalid soldiers, changed 2 letters, and added a new word to the English language. He called it the Battle Creek Sanitarium, and then he built it into something that no one in the mid-19th century could have predicted. UK joined as the bookkeeper. That title understates the reality. He managed the correspondence, the accounts, the scheduling, and the operational details that allowed his brother to function as a public intellectual. John Harvey lectured at medical schools, edited a magazine read by millions, wrote best-selling books, and performed surgery, all while operating the institution. He could do all of this because WK absorbed everything the institution required that John Harvey had no interest in doing himself. The sanitarium grew. In its first full year, 1866, it had recorded 106 patients. Under John Harvey's direction, that number climbed steadily across 3 decades. By 1906, the SAN processed 7,006 patrons in a single year. At its peak, the complex covered 30 acres and contained more than 30 buildings. The central structure alone had room for approximately 400 guests and treatment facilities capable of handling more than 1,000 patients. The staff numbered between 800 and 1,000, including 30 physicians. The clientele became famous. Henry Ford came, presidents came, Calvin Coolidge, Warren Harding, William Howard Taft. Amelia Earhart came. The Rockefellers, the Roosevelts, and J.C. Penney came. Mary Todd Lincoln had been an earlier visitor. Sojourner Truth, who lived nearby in Battle Creek, spent time there. Battle Creek transformed from a remote, dusty town into the busiest railroad stop in Michigan outside of Detroit. John Harvey's treatments were a specific blend of religious conviction and medical innovation. Vegetarianism, hydrotherapy, exercise, sunbathing, abstinence from tobacco and alcohol. He was, a century before the term existed, a wellness practitioner, and he was building the largest wellness institution in the world. Throughout all of it, WK managed the books, negotiated the debts, and ensured that the dining tables sparkled with crystal and silver. He received no public recognition. Historians who have studied the archives at the Bentley Historical Library at the University of Michigan describe him as a man who resented, quietly and for years, playing second fiddle to his more flamboyant brother. The institution was John Harvey's. The labor, in large part, was WK's. Chapter 3. The Accidental Grain. The problem with the sanitarium's patients was, in a very practical sense, the food. John Harvey Kellogg had developed what he called biologic living, a comprehensive philosophy of diet and hygiene that required his patients to eat simple, plant-based, easily digestible meals. The standard American diet of the late 19th century ran in the opposite direction. Historians note that Americans at the time ate heavily fried foods, cured meats, salted and fatty preparations, and grain that had been overcooked into paste. Walt Whitman described the resulting epidemic of digestive complaints as the Great American Stomach Ache. Dyspepsia, chronic indigestion, was among the most common complaints at the sanitarium. John Harvey understood, correctly for the time, that complex starches were difficult for compromised digestive systems to process. He theorized that if grains could be pre-processed to convert more of their starch into a simpler sugar, they would be easier to absorb. He and WK and John Harvey's wife, Ella Eaton Kellogg, began experimenting in the sanitarium kitchen. They produced granola, a name John Harvey coined, by grinding double-baked Zwieback bread into crumbs. Patients tolerated it. The brothers were not satisfied. There had to be a better method. Then, sometime around 1894, exactly who deserves credit for the discovery has never been resolved to the satisfaction of all parties. A batch of wheatberry dough was left sitting overnight. The prevailing account holds that John Harvey was called away on another matter and left the dough behind. Rather than discard it the next morning, it was sent through the rollers. It came out as delicate, thin flakes. Baked, they held their shape. WK is credited with reliably recreating the process, understanding what had happened, and refining it into something reproducible. By 1895, they had a flaked wheat cereal they called Granos, and it was being served to patients and mailed to former guests who had returned home and wanted more. The cornflake variety came soon after. The problem was visibility. John Harvey allowed anyone in the sanitarium to observe the flaking process, including a patient named C.W. Post, who had arrived in 1891 unable to pay his room and board, and who had worked it off in the kitchen. Post later settled permanently in Battle Creek, opened his own competing facility, and founded a dry food company built on what he had seen and learned inside the SAN. Postum appeared in 1895. Post cereals followed. John Harvey had handed a competitor the foundation of his business, and he had done it willingly because he did not think commercially. WK did. He wanted the cornflake protected. He wanted it manufactured at scale. He wanted it sold to the general American public, not the sick and the wealthy who visited the sanitarium, but the millions of ordinary people who simply needed a convenient, inexpensive breakfast. John Harvey refused. The cornflake was a medical product, in his view, a tool for patient care, not a commodity to be advertised and mass-produced. He forbade WK from distributing it beyond the sanitarium's existing customers. By the late 1890s, the brothers had formed a food company, the Sanitas Food Company, to sell their grain products more formally. But John Harvey still set the limits. WK was still subject to his brother's authority. He had helped develop the product. He had refined the process. And he could not take it anywhere without permission. More than 40 cereal companies were launched across America in the early 1900s, chasing the market that John Harvey refused to acknowledge. WK watched each one arrive. Chapter 4. The Break. In the end, it was a question of sugar. WK had concluded that the cornflake, as it existed, plain, austere, unsweetened, would not move in a commercial market. He wanted to add malt, sugar, and salt to the dough. He believed these additions were the difference between a therapeutic product for sanitarium patients and a breakfast food that ordinary Americans would choose to buy. John Harvey would not agree. The sanitarium existed to reform American eating habits, not to accommodate them. Sugar was not part of biologic living. This disagreement was the last one. It was not the first. There had been years of smaller conflicts, but it was the one that made the distance between them permanent and institutional. On February 19, 1906, W.K. Kellogg signed the papers forming the Battle Creek Toasted Corn Flake Company. He was 45 years old. He had worked under his brother for approximately 25 years. He had arranged the acquisition of rights to the cornflake manufacturing process from John. He formulated his product with the additions John had refused: sugar, malt, salt, and he began producing it at a factory in Battle Creek. He also began advertising. A campaign ran in newspapers telling readers to wink at their grocer and see what they got: a free sample of WK's cornflakes. In New York City alone, the campaign increased sales 15-fold. The company was profitable rapidly. Then, on July 4, 1907, a fire destroyed the main factory building. WK had the new plant in full operation within 6 months. By 1909, the company was producing 120,000 cases of cornflakes per day. John Harvey's response was to file suit. Not long after WK's company launched, John began producing his own cereals and marketing them under the Kellogg name. His argument was that he was the original Kellogg, the physician, the inventor, the figure who had made the name worth anything in the first place. WK's argument was that everyone in America who heard the word Kellogg now thought of cornflakes, and that John's inferior product threatened a brand that WK had built with his own money and his own advertising. The lawsuit moved through the courts for the better part of a decade. It reached the Michigan Supreme Court. In 1911, WK won the right to exclusive use of the Kellogg name in the United States. A ruling later extended to international markets through litigation that continued until 1921. The brothers had entered the 20th century as collaborators, bound by blood, by institution, and by a shared accident in a sanitarium kitchen. By the time the last court ruling was handed down, they were strangers in the same town who, by most accounts, rarely, if ever, spoke again. What WK had built was the beginning of a global company. What John Harvey had built was an institution that would outlast their feud, though only just, and a personal legacy that contained contradictions far darker than a business dispute. The story of what each of them did with the power and the money that followed is where this account is headed. Chapter 5. The Doctor's Other Kingdom. There are institutions built on genuine conviction, and there are institutions built on the need to remain powerful. Sometimes they are the same institution. By the time WK's company began producing 120,000 cases of cornflakes per day, by the time it was clear that the man who had spent 25 years as a bookkeeper had won, commercially, in a way that could not be reversed, John Harvey Kellogg was already moving his energy somewhere else. He was not finished building empires. He was simply building a different kind. It is important to state what John Harvey was, in full. He was a physician who was genuinely ahead of his time on several questions: the relationship between diet and digestive health, the hazards of tobacco, the importance of exercise and sleep. The sanitarium he built was a real institution that served thousands of patients, including the poor alongside the famous. He was a genuine medical innovator. He was also, in the last 30 years of his life, one of the most prominent advocates of eugenics in the United States. The Race Betterment Foundation was formally organized in Battle Creek. By 1914, when it held its first national conference at the sanitarium, John Harvey's eugenics ambitions had become institutional. More than 400 delegates attended that first conference. The subject was the improvement of the human race through hereditary selection, the prevention of reproduction among those deemed unfit, and the construction of a registry that would assign pedigrees to prospective parents the way a kennel club evaluates breeding stock. John Harvey's co-founders included Irving Fisher, a Yale economist, and Charles Davenport, a Harvard biologist who directed the Eugenics Record Office. The movement they represented was not fringe at this moment in American history. It was a mainstream scientific discussion, conducted in university lecture halls and government hearing rooms. At one of the conferences, a eugenicist named Harry Laughlin presented calculations claiming that 15 million sterilizations would be necessary to cleanse the American gene pool of what he called social menaces. The second conference was held at the Panama Pacific Exposition in San Francisco in 1915. A third was held in Battle Creek in 1928. The conferences produced publications, a eugenics registry, and a Fitter Families campaign that ran from 1928 into the late 1930s, giving awards to families who met standards of racial hygiene in the way that county fairs gave ribbons to prize livestock. John Harvey favored racial segregation. He believed immigrants and people of non-European descent would damage what he called the white American gene pool. He worked on the Michigan Board of Health and helped push sterilization authorization into state law. Michigan's sterilization statute of 1923 led to 3,786 documented forced sterilizations. African Americans and people in poverty were the primary targets. There is a sharp and uncomfortable irony embedded in this history. John Harvey and his wife Ella had fostered 42 children during their marriage, children of various backgrounds, including those considered, by the social standards of the time, undesirable. His biographers note that he and Ella believed environment could, in theory, overcome hereditary tendency. He held both ideas at once: the institutional push toward racial selection and a personal household that contradicted it. History does not resolve this contradiction cleanly. Neither did he. The sanitarium itself was struggling. It entered receivership in 1933. The Great Depression had taken its wealthy, patient base. A 14-story tower, added in 1928 against John Harvey's wishes to attract the highest-paying guests, was in financial trouble almost from the moment it was completed. In 1942, the U.S. Army purchased the main sanitarium building for approximately $2.3 million and converted it into a military hospital. John Harvey relocated his remaining operations to smaller buildings and continued working. He was 90 years old. He had outlasted the institution that defined him. He was still wearing his white suit. He died in Battle Creek on December 14, 1943, at the age of 91. In his will, he left his entire estate to the Race Betterment Foundation, the eugenics organization he had built alongside the sanitarium, the monument to a set of ideas that history would soon and decisively condemn. Chapter 6. The mansion he called a cottage. While his brother was organizing eugenics conferences, W.K. Kellogg was doing something that looked, on the surface, like pure accumulation. But the evidence suggests he had already decided by his middle years that the money was not the point. He had paid $500,000 to acquire the cornflake manufacturing rights from John Harvey before starting his company in 1906. By the mid-1920s, he was a wealthy man by any standard. He retired as president of the Kellogg Company in 1929. He had already begun thinking systematically about what to do with what he had built. In 1925, he and his second wife, Dr. Carrie Staines Kellogg, a physician who had worked at the Battle Creek Sanitarium, commissioned a summer estate at Gull Lake, 15 miles from company headquarters in Battle Creek. The architects were Benjamin and Benjamin of Grand Rapids. The interior was furnished by Marshall Field and Company of Chicago. The result was a neo-Tudor manor house of 18 rooms set on a 30-acre estate with 1,600 feet of Gull Lake shoreline, positioned on the highest knoll above the water. The roof was Ludowici imperial shingle tile. The entrance hall featured an English Gothic carved staircase. The floors and the fireplace were faced in rookwood tile. The windows carried heraldic shields in leaded glass. The estate included a windmill, a greenhouse potting shed, a boathouse, a stable, a combined guest house and garage with a chauffeur's residence, and a separate caretaker's cottage. It was, by any reasonable measure, a mansion. W.K. called it his cottage. The house measured 15,000 square feet. He moved into it in 1926. That same year, he and Dr. Carey deeded the property to the city of Battle Creek, with the condition that the estate become a place where, as the deed stated, all of Battle Creek may forever play. They retained a life lease, meaning they could live in it for the remainder of their lives, but the intention was always public. He was building something that would outlast him, and handing it over before he was gone. In 1930, on June 21st, 3 of W.K.'s trusted colleagues signed the Articles of Association for a charitable foundation bearing his name. It was called the W.K. Kellogg Child Welfare Foundation, later shortened to the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. The founding vision was explicit: to improve the health, happiness, and well-being of children, without discrimination as to race, creed, or geographical distribution. 4 years later, in 1934, W.K. donated more than $66 million in Kellogg Company stock and other investments to the W.K. Kellogg Trust, which funded the foundation. In doing so, he gave away the majority of his equity in the company, approximately 54% of the common stock. His stated motivation was not abstract. In 1913, his grandson Kenneth Williamson had fallen from a second-story window as a toddler. W.K. wrote to a physician in Battle Creek that the accident caused him to wonder what difficulties were in the paths of needy parents who seek help for their children when catastrophe strikes, and that he resolved to lend what aid he could to such children. The Foundation's Michigan Community Health Project, launched in its first year, built hospitals in rural areas, deployed nurses to remote towns, and organized public health departments across 7 counties in southern Michigan. The Ann J. Kellogg School in Battle Creek, named for W.K.'s mother, became one of the first schools in the country to teach children with disabilities alongside children without disabilities. In 1925, he had also purchased 377 acres near Pomona, California, for $250,000 to fulfill a lifelong interest in Arabian horses. By 1932, the property had grown to 750 acres, and he donated it to the University of California, stipulating that the breeding program and a tradition of free Sunday horse shows be maintained indefinitely. The ranch eventually became the campus of California State Polytechnic University, Pomona. More than 26,000 students attend that university today. W.K. Kellogg spent the last 2 decades of his life giving away most of what the cornflake had made him. Glaucoma had left him legally blind by the time he was approximately 80 years old. He attended every foundation board meeting anyway, accompanied by a German shepherd descended from a lineage that included Rin Tin Tin. He was, as one of his biographers describes it, a man who had said as early as 1909 that he wanted to make good use of any wealth that might come to him. The wealth came. He used it. And all the while, 80 miles from the Gull Lake cottage he had built and then given away, his brother, the physician, the famous man, the one whose name had once appeared in newspaper profiles when WK's did not, was presiding over a eugenics foundation whose trustees would one day reduce it to a balance of $4.92. Chapter 7. The Letter That Was Never Sent. There is a document in the Bentley Historical Library at the University of Michigan. It is a letter. By most accounts, it was written around 1941. John Harvey Kellogg was in his late 80s. W.K. was in his early 80s and had recently gone blind. They had not spoken meaningfully to each other in decades. Encounters between them, when unavoidable, required a neutral third party to be present in the room. W.K. had insisted on this. In his final years, John Harvey drafted a letter to his younger brother. In it, he wrote that he was sure W.K. had been right about the business. He wrote that he earnestly desired to make amends for any wrong or injustice of any sort he had done to him. John Harvey's secretary read the letter. She decided that her employer had demeaned himself in it. She considered the apology beneath the dignity of the man she worked for. She did not send the letter. She filed it away. John Harvey died on December 14, 1943. He died assuming that W.K. had received the letter and simply refused to respond. That silence, which he may have interpreted as a final rejection, was in fact no silence at all. The letter had never arrived. W.K. Kellogg continued on. He had survived his brother by years when the letter was finally found and brought to him. It was 1948. W.K. was 88 years old. He was blind. The letter was read to him by a nurse. What W.K. said or felt, after hearing his brother's words read aloud in a voice that was not his brother's, is not recorded. Howard Markel, who had full access to the Bentley archives and studied both men across years of scholarship, noted that it is hard to know whether a real reconciliation would have followed, even if the letter had arrived on time. The architecture of that relationship had been laid before either man could choose. An older brother elevated by patrons. A younger brother handed a ledger and a desk. 25 years of accumulated subordination. A decade of litigation over a name. Decades more of silence. One court ruling that settled the commercial question and left everything else permanently open. In the end, the only apology that existed between them sat in a desk drawer for 7 years. One brother died, without knowing it had not been sent. The other heard it read to him by a stranger, in a voice he could no longer see, at an age when there was no one left to forgive. Chapter 8. What Two Empires Cost. By the early 1950s, the physical map of both empires was already being redistributed. W.K. Kellogg died on October 6, 1951, in Battle Creek, Michigan. He was 91 years old. The cause was circulatory illness. He was buried at Oak Hill Cemetery in Battle Creek. His Gull Lake estate, the cottage he had deeded to the public, had already passed to Michigan State College the year before. The Arabian Horse Ranch in Pomona had been transferred to the state of California in 1949 and was on its way to becoming a university. The foundation he had established held more than $66 million in endowment. It would grow. John Harvey Kellogg had died 8 years earlier, on December 14, 1943, also in Battle Creek, also at the age of 91. He was buried at Oak Hill Cemetery. His plot was adjacent to his brother's. The court proceedings following John Harvey's death produced a settlement that awarded a new Adventist-run Michigan Sanitarium Corporation $550,000 in cash and 3 farms valued at $75,000 in exchange for releasing claims on the institution he had directed for 67 years. The sanitarium's main building had already become a military hospital. By 1954, it was a federal office building, the Race Betterment Foundation, to which John Harvey had left his entire estate, held $687,000 in assets in 1947. By 1967, its account stood at $492.87. The state of Michigan closed the foundation. The trustees were indicted for squandering the funds. The eugenics registry was never built to any lasting scale. The conferences became historical documents. The Fitter Families Campaign became a case study. The intellectual framework that John Harvey had helped construct found its most consequential expression, not in Michigan, but in Europe, where the Nazi sterilization law of 1933 drew directly from American eugenics precedents, including the work presented at conferences where John Harvey was a presiding figure. More than 400,000 people were sterilized under that law. It was the legal prelude to broader programs of racial extermination. John Harvey Kellogg did not build those programs, but he helped build the framework of ideas that traveled toward them. Historians are careful to note this as a fact of influence and intellectual lineage, not an attribution of personal guilt for what others did with those ideas decades later. The distinction matters. So does the lineage. W.K.'s empire, by contrast, compounded. The W.K. Kellogg Foundation grew across the decades, building hospitals, funding medical schools, creating scholarships for Black South Africans during apartheid, expanding into international public health. Its assets today exceed $8.7 billion, making it one of the largest philanthropic foundations in the world. The Cornflake Company, which had survived fires, the Great Depression, a decade of litigation, and the departure of its founder, continued to produce breakfast food for markets on every inhabited continent. 2 men, 1 family, 1 accidental grain, 2 completely different answers to the question of what power is for. Ending. What remains is scattered across Michigan, California, and institutional memory. The W.K. Kellogg Manor House still stands on the highest knoll above Gull Lake in Hickory Corners, Michigan. Michigan State University manages it. Visitors can walk the grounds from dawn to dusk. The neo-Tudor architecture, the rookwood tile, the carved staircase, the heraldic glass, the windmill on its own small island, is preserved largely as it was in 1926, when a man who called it a cottage handed it to the public before he was finished living in it. The Battle Creek Sanitarium building, the one that cost $1 million to build in 1903, the one that processed 7,006 patients in the year W.K. walked away from it, is now the Hart Dole Inouye Federal Center. It was named after 3 United States senators who were patients there during the Second World War, when it was a military hospital for the wounded. The building still stands on North Washington Avenue in Battle Creek in the Italian Renaissance Revival style, with its Ionic columns and its coffered lobby ceiling. Federal employees work in it. The W.K. Kellogg Foundation still operates in Battle Creek. It funds programs in Michigan, Mississippi, New Mexico, and New Orleans, and internationally in Mexico and Haiti. Its endowment has grown from $66 million to more than $8.7 billion. Its founding documents still carry the language W.K. signed in 1930, without discrimination as to race, creed, or geographical distribution. California State Polytechnic University, Pomona, built on the Arabian Horse Ranch W.K., purchased for $250,000, Darich, is now a public university. Its W.K. Kellogg Arabian Horse Center still holds free Sunday shows, as the deed of 1932 required. The Race Betterment Foundation is gone. It ended with $492.87. The cornflake, which began as a dietary aid for sanitarium patients in the 1890s, is still manufactured in Battle Creek and in factories on multiple continents. The name on the box is the name WK won in court. The brothers are buried 8 feet apart, give or take, in Oak Hill Cemetery in Battle Creek. Sojourner Truth is buried nearby. So is C.W. Post, the man who copied their recipes and built his own company. So is Ellen White, whose vision for a health institute in a remote Michigan town set the entire chain of events in motion. The true cost of what happened between these two men is not measurable in money, though the money is the easiest thing to count. It is measurable, more honestly, in what a quarter century of suppressed ability produces in a person. What accumulates in a man who sets his brother's schedule, manages his correspondence, absorbs his institutional labor, and goes unmentioned in the profiles, and in what a person does with authority when no one has ever effectively challenged it. W.K. gave his money to children. John Harvey gave his to an ideology that history has judged as one of the more consequential failures of the progressive scientific mind. The unsent letter, which asked for forgiveness in words that never reached their destination, may be the most honest document either of them produced. It said what was true. It arrived too late. It was heard by a man who could not see, in a room whose silence afterward went unrecorded. Some debts cannot be settled. Some letters cannot be delivered. And some empires, built on a single grain and a lifetime of shared resentment, leave behind only the things that outlived the men who made them, standing in the Michigan light, still open for tours, still waiting to be understood.